Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into Timothy Leary, the clinical psychologist who dismantled the American cognitive architecture, hacked his own prime diagnostic test, and rebuilt human consciousness in exile.
You really have to ground yourself in the reality of today, March 30, 2026, because we are existing in a profound historical paradox. Consider the current medical landscape.
Right, with massive, heavily funded clinical trials for psychedelics running continuously at places like Johns Hopkins and Imperial College, it's completely state-sanctioned now.
Exactly. Psilocybin-assisted therapy actually holds FDA Breakthrough Therapy designation. The paradigm has completely shifted.
Yet, the primary architect of this medical revolution, the man who first mapped the outer limits of the human nervous system using these exact compounds, remains buried under decades of political propaganda.
Which is why our mission today is to forensically deconstruct Leary's life. We are entirely bypassing that whole counterculture caricature the 20th century state manufactured.
Instead, we're examining him as a rigorous clinical scientist, a man who was structurally engineered to absorb the punitive kinetic energy of a terrified American empire.
To understand how a clinical mind becomes a primary target for the state, you first have to examine its initial construction. Leary was born in 1920 in Springfield, Massachusetts, into a very strict Irish Catholic environment.
So the psychological boundaries of his youth were completely dictated by the inflexible dogma of the church.
Right, but that structural rigidity fractured early. His father, who was a military dentist, abandoned the family. He left behind this profound void of traditional authority.
Well, when the primary enforcer of the rules just vanishes, you naturally start questioning the foundational validity of the architecture of rules altogether.
That is exactly the causal link. That early skepticism became the engine driving his academic progression. He navigates West Point, moves through the University of Alabama, and by 1950, he secures his doctorate in clinical psychology from UC Berkeley.
And we have to remember, mid-20th century Berkeley was the absolute bastion of empirical behaviorism.
Completely. This was a landscape where the profound complexities of the human mind were relentlessly reduced to statistical standard deviations, just observable behavioral patterns.
But he didn't just survive that sterile environment, he mastered it. He essentially weaponized those metrics.
He did, and this mastery culminated in his appointment as Director of Psychological Research at the Kaiser Foundation Hospital in Oakland.
Which was a massive clinical structure, essentially a machine designed for the efficient processing of human pathology.
Exactly, and it was within that machine that he developed his defining early work, the Leary Interpersonal Circumplex.
Let's actually break down how that tool functioned.
Yeah.
He built this complex two-dimensional model mapping human personality traits strictly along axes of dominance and affiliation.
Right. So picture a grid where every human interaction, every subtle nuance of personality is plotted as a literal coordinate.
When you analyze this tool through a modern lens, it is the mid-century equivalent of algorithmic profiling.
That's the perfect analogy. He was reducing the vast, chaotic landscape of human emotion to sterile data points. The physician could diagnose human suffering without ever actually engaging the subjective, messy experience of the patient.
So he became a highly efficient, celebrated component of the medical machine. But that mechanical efficiency practically guaranteed an epistemological catastrophe when he was finally confronted with raw trauma.
An absolute catastrophe. Let's translate that out of academia. In October 1955, Leary walked into his garage and found his first wife, Marianne Busch, dead by suicide.
God, which is obviously a devastating personal tragedy, but structurally, it also completely shattered the illusion of his clinical detachment.
The fundamental way he understood the world broke. His psychometric models, the very architecture of his professional life, were entirely incapable of processing that level of despair.
Right, you cannot plot the raw agony of suicide on an axis of dominance and affiliation.
You can't. He realized he was functioning as an anonymous institutional robot, completely alienated from the true nature of consciousness. The sterile framework of orthodox psychology had categorically failed him.
And the failure of those diagnostic models directly causes his vulnerability to the psilocybin experience. He could no longer tolerate existing within the manicured lawns of the American academic establishment.
That deep psychological displacement is exactly what drove him to Cuernavaca, Mexico in August 1960. The physical shift away from the rigid structures of the United States lowered his defensive perimeters.
Leaving the American institutional architecture behind opened a crucial cognitive window. And that window was immediately exploited by a powerful botanical agent.
Beside a swimming pool at a Cuernavaca villa, he consumed psilocybin mushrooms. Within hours, the compound systematically dismantled decades of orthodox academic training.
The carefully maintained illusion of the objective scientific observer just collapsed. What was left was raw, unmediated consciousness.
And the phenomenological impact of that afternoon dictated the entire trajectory of the rest of his life. The artificial boundaries between observer and observed, between subject and object, dissolved entirely.
Because he recognized those boundaries as convenient fictions maintained by limited neurological processing, right?
Exactly. This complete restructuring of how knowledge is acquired meant he could never return to traditional behavioral science. Yet, remarkably, he brought this cognitive revolution directly into the fortress of establishment legitimacy.
Harvard University. Securing a position at the Center for Research and Personality in 1960, he launches the Harvard Psilocybin Project.
The stated objective to the university was rigorous scientific investigation, but the unstated objective was the systematic dismantling of consensus reality itself.
He immediately weaponized this research against the institutional behavioral models he had once championed. Consider the methodology of the 1961 Concord prison experiment.
Right, Leary applied psilocybin within a strictly controlled carceral setting. His hypothesis was that the psychedelic experience could fundamentally restructure criminal behavioral patterns.
By allowing inmates at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution to transcend conditioned identities, he believed he could alter their trajectory. And early follow-ups actually showed significantly reduced recidivism.
He was hacking the criminal justice loop, and he escalated this methodology dramatically the following year.
April 20th, 1962. Under Leary's direct supervision, graduate student Walter Pahnke executes the Good Friday experiment at Boston University's Marsh Chapel.
Pahnke administered psilocybin to theology students specifically to test if the compound could reliably induce genuine mystical religious experiences.
And he utilized a double-blind setup with an active placebo. The results were staggering, weren't they?
They were. The experimental group reported ego dissolution and encounters with a divine presence that perfectly matched classical historical descriptions of mystical states.
But you must view this escalation through the lens of institutional survival. Harvard was watching its own highly credentialed researcher consume these compounds alongside his subjects.
His lectures shifted away from clinical analysis and moved entirely toward mass consciousness expansion.
Let me play devil's advocate here and actually defend the institution. If you are the institutional guardian of Harvard's reputation in 1963, do you not have an absolute obligation to terminate this researcher?
Oh, without question.
I mean, Leary was literally taking drugs with his students. He had entirely abandoned the pretense of the objective observer in favor of quasi-religious evangelism. Harvard is an empirical research institution, not a psychedelic monastery.
You are exactly right, and the institution reacted precisely as its architecture dictated. In May 1963, Harvard fired Timothy Leary, citing a lack of proper research protocols and his failure to attend scheduled lectures.
But Harvard fundamentally miscalculated the outcome.
Catastrophically, the physical expulsion from the campus caused a massive, unintended consequence. By stripping him of institutional containment, Harvard forced his transformation.
From a respected, localized academic into a decentralized cultural revolutionary. Without the boundaries of establishment approval, his influence scaled exponentially.
That geographical and professional exile necessitated the creation of a new sovereign laboratory, which brings us to the Millbrook Estate in New York.
Millbrook operated as a 2,500-acre fortress for the League for Spiritual Discovery. Leary utilized this massive 64-room mansion to blend LSD protocols, Eastern philosophy, and the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
It was a continuous, immersive laboratory for human consciousness. The isolation from urban surveillance allowed him to bypass government regulation entirely.
And it was within this sovereign zone that he engineered the structural simplicity of his cultural directive. Turn on, tune in, drop out.
Turn on the dormant neural circuits, tune into the cosmic frequency and natural environment, and drop out of the artificial consumerist roles imposed by the state.
That three-word mantra essentially rewired the American counterculture. It also solidified the intellectual trinity of the psychedelic revolution.
Let's look at that trinity. Leary provided the institutional legitimacy, the psychological frameworks, and the mass cultural visibility.
Right, and he intersected seamlessly with Terence McKenna, who was constructing the philosophical and anthropological framework around natural botanical compounds. McKenna was deeply analyzing tryptamines harvested in tropical environments.
And completing this trinity was Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who had actually synthesized both LSD and psilocybin in the laboratory.
Together, they represented a unified, multidisciplinary front of psychedelic philosophy, a front that directly threatened the psychological monopoly of the state.
The state recognized that threat immediately. The establishment's terror regarding this expanded, uncontrollable consciousness mandated a theatrical and violent kinetic response.
December 22nd, 1965. G. Gordon Liddy leads a heavily armed raid on the Millbrook estate.
The architecture of that raid was completely performative. It was designed purely to generate media publicity and construct Leary's image as a dangerous, corrupting criminal.
And this deliberate escalation culminated in his March 19, 1966 arrest at the Laredo, Texas border. They found a minuscule amount of marijuana on his teenage daughter.
Leary assumed full legal responsibility, utilizing the arrest to challenge the constitutionality of the Marijuana Tax Act.
A brilliant legal maneuver. It forced the 1969 Supreme Court decision Leary v. United States, which actually ruled the act unconstitutional because it required self-incrimination.
But winning a Supreme Court case only amplified his status as a target. President Richard Nixon publicly labeled him the most dangerous man in America.
The accumulation of immense legal pressure, constant federal surveillance, and targeted vindictive prosecution finally results in a draconian sentence in 1970.
10 years in prison for 2 marijuana roaches. Let that sink in.
That sentence physically deposited him in the California men's colony in San Luis Obispo. This incarceration represented the carceral state's attempt to achieve total victory over individual consciousness.
They deployed the concrete, the steel, and the constant monitoring to prove that the brute physical force of state power could break the expanded mind.
But the institutional machinery possessed a fatal blind spot.
A massive one. During the standard intake process, prison psychologists administered a battery of diagnostic tests to determine Leary's security classification, his psychological stability, and his risk level.
And among the primary psychometric instruments used was the Leary Interpersonal Circumplex.
The state was literally utilizing the architect's own blueprints to attempt to categorize him.
I mean, imagine you are the warden of this facility. You think you've just locked up a dangerous, unpredictable radical. You don't realize you just handed him the master key to your entire psychological testing apparatus.
It's incredible.
It is the exact equivalent of a maximum security prison locking a master cybersecurity hacker in a cell, only for the hacker to realize the entire facility's security system is running on the source code they wrote a decade earlier.
Leary understood every diagnostic threshold, every hidden variable, and every scoring mechanism of the test. He manipulated the parameters flawlessly.
He deliberately answered the questions to map his personality profile as docile, compliant, and fundamentally non-threatening.
He engineered a psychometric profile that classified him as a model prisoner with an exceptionally low escape risk. This hacked profile legally secured his assignment to a minimum security guard in detail.
And securing that specific minimum security assignment directly causes his physical proximity to the perimeter fencing, which made the subsequent breach possible.
September 12, 1970. Armed with a smuggled rope, Leary escapes the California men's colony.
This was coordinated with the radical leftist organization, the Wetter Underground. This was not a chaotic, desperate breakout. It was a meticulous psychological heist.
Leary weaponized his mastery of psychometrics against the very institution designed to break him. But breaching the supposedly impenetrable prison resulted in a desperate, claustrophobic exile.
He flees to Algeria to seek protection from Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Panther Party in exile. But the theoretical solidarity between the psychedelic counterculture and the militant left instantly devolves.
The physical reality of Algeria devolved into constant surveillance and political manipulation. Cleaver's paranoia rapidly escalated into outright hostility.
Explain why that relationship fractured so completely.
Because Cleaver was fighting a kinetic, physical war for survival against the United States government. He viewed Leary as a bourgeois intellectual tourist merely playing at revolution.
Right, Leary is talking about cosmic consciousness while the Panthers are facing actual assassination.
Exactly. The extreme psychological pressure of being trapped by heavily armed, unpredictable revolutionaries forced Leary to flee yet again, seeking refuge in Switzerland.
This relentless geographical displacement ultimately ends in the absolute victory of the state apparatus. The capture occurs on January 17, 1973, at the International Airport in Kabul, Afghanistan.
We really have to strip away the romanticism of the outlaw narrative here. He was apprehended by armed agents, physically restrained in chains, flown across the globe, and deposited into Folsom State Prison.
Folsom was the ultimate architecture of punishment. Rows of concrete cells, constant ambient violence, and absolute isolation designed for total psychological domination.
He endured that brutal environment until his release in 1976, but that release was contingent upon cooperating with federal authorities and providing information to the FBI.
An act that deeply tarnished his legacy among his radical allies. It effectively severed him from the very counterculture movement he helped create.
But the severance from the physical counterculture directly forced his pivot toward the emerging digital landscape in the 1980s and 90s.
Leary recognized the personal computer as the new vehicle for consciousness expansion.
The physical ingestion of chemical compounds was entirely replaced by the digital ingestion of raw, unfiltered information.
By urging the youth to boot up their software and hack the foundational code of society, he laid the cybernetic groundwork for the early hacker ethic. The battleground for human freedom permanently migrated from the physical realm to the electronic frontier.
And he maintained this forensic control over his own narrative until the precise moment of his biological failure. On May 31, 1996, in Beverly Hills, Leary utilized his terminal prostate cancer to execute a final, highly public experiment.
Surrounded by digital recording devices, he documented the terrifying physiological process of dying.
He transformed the ultimate systemic biological shutdown into an exploration of consciousness transition.
And in a final defiance of planetary containment, a portion of his cremated remains was loaded into a rocket and launched past Earth's gravitational pull into deep space.
Bringing this forensic analysis back into our current reality of 2026, the massive, heavily fortified walls of the medical establishment have finally collapsed under the weight of his initial hypotheses.
The exact chemical compounds that resulted in his total excommunication from society, the compounds that landed him in Folsom Prison, are now generating 60 to 70% sustained remission rates for treatment-resistant depression in FDA-designated trials.
Modern psychiatry has been forced to acknowledge the profound efficacy of psilocybin and LSD protocols. The structural reality of the 20th century paradigm has been entirely rewritten.
When you synthesize these historical events, the ultimate takeaway is chilling.
Leary was a vital, sacrificial anomaly. The American empire required a highly visible target to absorb its collective terror regarding the uncontrollable nature of the expanded mind.
By forcing the state to overreact, by making it deploy its heavy carceral machinery against a clinical psychologist armed only with botanical compounds and psychological models, Leary exposed the profound cowardice of the institutional architecture.
His life was a meticulously executed stress test of American legal and academic systems. A test those institutions catastrophically failed. The persecution was an absolute structural necessity to force the evolution of the human operating system.
Which leaves you with a necessary structural question to evaluate your current reality. If the rigid, heavily armed architecture of the 20th century state was willing to deploy the full, terrifying weight of concrete prisons to suppress the inner mind, what new, invisible structures of digital and chemical control are currently being engineered right now in 2026 to ensure your nervous system remains locked within profitable, predictable circuits?
It is the defining question of our era.
Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.